The rise and fall of nations are directly proportional to commercial and military superiority at sea. A strong navy creates a strong deterrent and elevates both military and economic power to the next level. Undoubtedly, the U.S. Navy is considered the strongest navy, followed by the Russian Navy. For this reason, countries with great naval power have historically transformed naval power and its elements into a common foreign policy tool with strategic gains. However, Russia's attempt to invade Ukraine has begun to undermine this policy. With Vladimir Putin's initiation of the invasion of Ukraine, his isolation in the political arena took place at lightning speed. Left alone in the political arena, Vladimir Putin had to grapple with a series of sanctions. The most crucial sanctions imposed on Russia focused on weakening Russia's power at sea. Heavy sanctions, especially in the defense industry and trade, have started to show their long-term impact on the Russian Navy. The Russian Navy is now incapable of producing new ships and weapons and is left with many outdated ships. We have thoroughly investigated this desperate situation in the Russian Navy and the beginning of its collapse. As a result of our research, we have obtained very striking information. Russia is beginning to feel the effects of the sanctions most heavily in the maritime field. The sanctions are affecting Russian shipyards, the Navy, spare parts, the Russian maritime military industry, and the Russian international civil trade network. The fact that Russia can no longer produce ships has hit Putin like a cold shower. As you may recall, the Russian Navy could not renew its first aircraft carrier, Admiral Kuznetsov, due to the sanctions, and the ship is still unusable. Additionally, Russia has encountered many difficulties as it has been unable to update its old ships and submarines in the last 15 months. Engine parts and weapons systems are crucial for shipbuilding. Over the past 3 decades, the Russian Federation has become too reliant on the West for technology. There was no problem during peacetime, but the sanctions imposed in the last 15 months have devastated the Russian Navy, which depends on cutting-edge semiconductors, chips, and special spare parts. According to recent reports, Russian shipbuilding giant United Shipbuilding Corp. is running out of key engine parts. This has resulted in delays or halts in the production of tankers and ocean liners needed to transport the country's oil and cargo. Shortly after Russia launched the war on Ukraine, the United States and Europe imposed sanctions and export controls that disrupted the flow of engine parts, propellers, and fuel pumps to Russia. In addition to banning Russian ships from their ports, the European Union and the USA also imposed sanctions on tankers carrying Russian oil. These actions have forced Russian oil exporters to rely on an aging tanker fleet that now handles most of the country's oil exports by sea. A U.S. official stated that the state-owned United Shipbuilding has been under sanctions since 2014. However, the U.S. official mentioned that the equipment difficulties and the lack of foreign specialists in assembling parts became systemic after February 2022. United Shipbuilding is currently in the process of building 59 cargo ships. In 2020, it delivered 17 ships, and in 2021, it delivered 16 ships. However, according to insiders, only 4 cargo ships were built last year due to the unavailability of rudder propellers made in Germany. United Shipbuilding declined to comment on its orders or deliveries. United Shipbuilding and another state-owned enterprise, the Zvezda Shipbuilding Complex, are Russia's 2 largest shipyards. These shipyards build a variety of ships, ranging from nuclear-powered submarines and Navy frigates to icebreaker tankers and cruise ships. The clients of these shipyards are mostly from within Russia, so the production problems will primarily impact the country. The global shipbuilding industry, which is dominated by Asian shipyards, will have a limited impact from any issues. One of the regular customers of both Russian shipyards is the state-owned tanker operator Sovcomflot, which has also been sanctioned and forced to sell more than a third of its fleet and relocate its operations to Dubai. Infoline, an investment consultant in Russia, stated that local shipyards delivered 20% fewer ships last year compared to 2021. Tonnage increased slightly as Zvezda delivered 2 large tankers to another state-owned tanker owner, SOKAR. On the other hand, Russian shipping executives mentioned that shipyards are attempting to produce some of the missing parts themselves or replacing them with imports from China. However, Russian shipping executives state that building new supply chains and developing shipbuilding capabilities takes time and increases costs. Shipyards are lobbying the Kremlin for support and subsidies, such as the elimination of tax fees and penalties for missed delivery dates. Zvezda has signed contracts to deliver over 50 vessels this year, and the components for these ships were secured before the sanctions were imposed. However, putting them together was a collaborative task with Korean partners, according to individuals involved. This business has been halted due to the sanctions. A manager at Zvezda's factory in Bolshoi came and stated that the lack of imported engines has hindered production at the factory. The manager mentioned that it will take several years for some of these parts to be produced in Russia. Zvezda did not respond to requests for comment. Seville shipyards received $6 million in government support this year. However, executives say the prospects for import substitution are weak. Some executives believe that the Russian shipbuilding industry is facing its biggest challenge since the collapse of the Soviet Union. Managers expect thousands of jobs to disappear in the next year in shipyards and supporting manufacturers. Russian Deputy Prime Minister Denis Manturov stated earlier this year that United Shipbuilding and the Ministry of Industry and Trade will collaborate to produce large marine engines locally. The Ministry of Industry and Trade of Russia has announced that it will invest over $1 billion in the next 2 years for the development of engine building. In another development, the U.S. is imposing new sanctions on Russia and Iran for holding Americans hostage because the United States is working to prevent further captivity and potentially secure the release of currently detained citizens. These measures come amid several high-profile cases in which Americans were wrongfully detained. Wall Street Journal reporter Evan Gershkovich and ex-Marine Paul Whelan are being held in Russia on espionage charges, which they vehemently deny. American citizens Sia Maknamazi, Emad Sharji, and Morad Tabaz are being held in Iran's notorious Evin prison. The latest sanctions will target organizations that the United States accuses of being responsible for holding Americans hostage or wrongfully detaining them. Officials emphasize that these steps should serve as a warning to those considering taking Americans hostage. A senior management official said, "We are also demonstrating that engaging in this kind of horrific behavior, using people as pawns and bargaining chips, will not go without consequences. These are some of the consequences." However, questions remain about the real impact of these sanctions, as most of the organizations affected by the latest sanctions were already sanctioned by different U.S. authorities. The recent sanctions are the initial steps taken in connection with an executive order signed by Biden 9 months ago. The executive order aims to punish organizations or criminals responsible for holding Americans captive. The order also requires better communication with the families of Americans held hostage or detained overseas. Since then, the administration has secured the release of a significant number of Americans held overseas, including American basketball player Brittany Griner from Russia and 7 other Americans imprisoned in Venezuela. However, several high-profile cases remain unresolved. Officials stated that the recent sanctions are part of the overall strategy to prevent Americans from being taken hostage and to secure the release of those currently in custody. While implementing these actions, the U.S. government must be careful not to create additional obstacles to the release of unjustly imprisoned Americans. Officials mentioned that the sanctions could be lifted if Americans held in Russia or Iran are released. It appears that 2021 was the best year in terms of tonnage for Russian naval shipbuilding, reaching 80,000 tons, a 15% increase. In general, the Russian Navy added 7 large warships, 4 surface ships, and 3 submarines. Additionally, the fleet received 17 support ships and boats, 10 combat boats, and 3 Bastion coastal missile systems. However, 2022 turned out to be a disappointment, with almost no new builds commissioned due to the crisis in Navy shipbuilding, resulting in the worst performance in the first decade. It is likely that 2023 will see another decline in the number of ships and vessels delivered. While it would be an exaggeration to say that 2024 marks the edge of a cliff for Russian shipbuilding, it will reveal the extent to which the industry has managed to begin its journey of survival under the new and tougher sanctions regime. Ukraine's summer offensive continues with full force. While the Kiev troops are storming on the front lines, the Russian soldiers are trying to protect themselves from this storm. The Ukrainian armed forces are again blowing the winds of freedom over the 8 villages they liberated from Russian occupation. Ukrainian soldiers touted their gains last week and waved flags in the settlements of Novogeorgiyevka Livny, Storagev, Mukievka, Blagodany, Laukuva, Niskichny, and Pyatakotki. The 128th Jaeger Brigade and the 2nd Separate Rifle Battalion liberated the village of Yakutsk the other day. Russian troops are shocked and cornered by the loss of their territories. However, the troubles of the Russian soldiers are not limited to this much. The Russian army suffers enormous losses on the front lines. The psychology of the Russian soldiers who suffered both soldier and ammunition losses was destroyed. Another blow to the demoralized Russian soldiers was cholera in the occupied part of the Kherson region. The Russian armed forces are grappling with cases of cholera. A military partisan movement has announced that the Russian army has been hit by a cholera epidemic. Days after the collapse of the Novokakhovka Dam in southern Ukraine caused catastrophic flooding. Artesh, a military movement of Ukrainians and Crimean Tatars with 41,000 subscribers on Telegram, quoted informants from military hospitals in the Kherson region and Crimea that every day many Russian soldiers are hospitalized with suspected cases of potentially fatal cholera. The group reported that several Russian soldiers were killed. This situation poses a very serious threat to the Russian army. The case of cholera is a very important issue in terms of both the number of soldiers and the psychology of the soldiers. At the same time, the attack and defense abilities of the soldiers are also limited. Russian troops coming from the Kherson direction along the northern Crimea Channel are losing their combat capability. Many of the Russian soldiers are being evacuated for treatment. In addition, Russian forces are experiencing problems in the distribution of clean and purifying bottled water. This represents a major barrier to soldiers' access to clean and potable water. It is likely that cholera cases are increasing as the use of water from open sources increases. Authorities in the region urged residents of the Kherson region and Crimea to pay particular attention to drinking water and food. Considering the financial, medical, and logistical needs brought by the epidemic, it remains unclear how the Russian leader will deal with these problems. On the other hand, it is not the first time that the Russian army has attempted to combat epidemics, as it will be remembered. The Russian army has been shaken by anthrax cases in the past months. Anthrax is a bacterial infection that can be spread through infected animal carcasses and food. Symptoms include diarrhea and vomiting blood. The disease was endemic to most of the Soviet Union in the 20th century due to intensive cattle breeding. More than 10,000 cases of anthrax in humans were recorded each year at the turn of the century. But this has been greatly reduced due to improved health standards. But the Russians caused the re-emergence of this disease in the Ukraine war, causing a major crisis. The Russian continent was probably aimed at strengthening their defenses in the Zaporizhia region before the long-awaited Ukrainian counteroffensive. They were digging trenches as part of their efforts. Russian soldiers fell ill with anthrax during these excavations. While Russian troops were digging defensive trenches in southern Ukraine, they uncovered a cemetery containing cattle carcasses. Then it was reported that the soldiers who participated in the excavation were infected with anthrax. Some of the soldiers were first brought to Melitopol Hospital, but after the diagnosis was confirmed, they were quickly discharged and taken to an unknown location. After the doctor's diagnoses, the soldiers were immediately quarantined. Moreover, the numbers were not so few as to be underestimated. Also, we have just informed you that Russian soldiers are having trouble accessing clean water. So what are the root causes of the problem? Let's take a look at the causes of clean water scarcity. The United Nations has stated that hundreds of millions of people around the world are suffering from famine caused by Russian attacks and attitudes. It is the masses of innocent people who suffer the most in the war. The Russian authorities, on the other hand, seem determined to remain silent on the issue. A massive explosion occurred at the Kakhovskaya hydroelectric power station in the past weeks. This explosion was described by some circles as the greatest man-made disaster. With these and similar events, the clean water resources used by the public are greatly damaged. Of course, the situation is not different in terms of food and supplies. The Russians' aim is to complicate the advance of the Russian troops. Of course, also to cover up their own retreats. At the same time, Russian troops are not too worried about the problems of people's access to clean water. But this is also causing trouble for the Russian troops themselves day by day. The scale of the disaster, which dries up a huge reservoir used for drinking water and irrigation, is only just beginning to emerge. Hundreds of settlements are still underwater, including some under Russian occupation. International humanitarian organizations share their concerns about widespread pollution and the possibility of disease. Ukrainian health officials argue that they watch for signs of illness cautiously. According to the statement made the other day by the Kherson City Clinical Hospital, the necessary medical supplies are currently being prepared for infectious diseases such as cholera. However, there are no reported cases of disease among civilian citizens yet. However, preparations continue for worst-case scenarios. As it is known, the Ukrainian forces are making great efforts to retake the Russian-occupied areas. The potential for epidemics becomes a significant threat in such a situation. There are no cases of epidemic disease reported from the Ukrainian army yet. But as Ukrainian military action accelerates, civilians near the front line now face not only the threat of war, but also the specter of disease. Floods can increase the transmission of infectious waterborne diseases such as typhoid fever, cholera, leptospirosis, and hepatitis A. Local authorities and Ukrainian military forces are reporting that they are taking action against Russian aggression. However, this aggressive attitude of Russia has caused serious damage to Ukrainian cities and civilians. In order to compensate for these losses of Ukraine, its Western allies are again stepping in. The UK government is proposing a law that would allow it to divert frozen Russian assets to the rebuilding of Ukraine and keep sanctions in place until Moscow pays compensation to its war-torn neighbor. Since the start of the war, the UK has frozen about $23 billion in assets and sanctioned 1,550 people. The government's latest proposal will require sanctioned persons to disclose their presence in Britain. It is also estimated that the cost of rebuilding Ukraine will exceed $411 billion. According to the latest figures from the World Bank, the European Commission, and the United Nations, the bank's estimate was calculated ahead of the massive destruction caused by the collapse of the Kakhovka Dam in southern Ukraine this month. As the war enters its second year, calls for the seizure of Russian assets and their use to rebuild Ukraine have increased. Last week, the United States Senate passed a bipartisan bill to confiscate Russian assets and use them to rebuild Ukraine. The issue is expected to come up at the Ukraine Rescue Conference held in London. As a result, it is an undeniable fact that the socio-psychological effects of the war are at a high level. At the same time, attacks on critical points cause various epidemics affecting both civilians and soldiers. It is miraculous that the wave of epidemics has not reached the Ukrainian army so far. This week, Ukrainian forces carried out attacks on very strategic points under Russian control in Crimea. Ukrainian forces carried out attacks on the Russian Navy port in Sebastopol and Simferopol, as well as on military airfields with Russian ammunition trains. While this situation created a very serious atmosphere of panic and anxiety among the civilians of Crimea, it also rekindled the Ukrainian resistance as the resistance activities strengthened. The Russians began to leave the peninsula more. The Ukrainian flag was hoisted on a communications tower in Crimea this week, according to a Ukrainian official. The official said that the resistance against Russian rule is growing in the Black Sea Peninsula. The Southern Operational Command of the Ukrainian Army has released a video. The footage showed the Ukrainian flag waving in the village of Georgievka in the Sudik district of Crimea. Earlier this week, tensions have been escalating in recent weeks as Ukraine signals its intention to retake Crimea. In February, a Ukrainian official said that his country was preparing assault brigades to retake Russian-controlled territory, including Crimea. It is feared that such a move would be a red line for Russia and Putin could use his country's nuclear capabilities to defend the region. The national flag of Ukraine appeared on a Russian communications tower yesterday. Very soon, such events will no longer surprise Ukrainians because blue and yellow will calmly float above every building on the peaceful and free Ukrainian peninsula. The hand flag is a symbol of Ukraine's resistance to Russian rule in the peninsula. But for now, the Ukrainian flag in Russian-controlled territory is another symbol of the resistance of the Ukrainian people, which is not only strengthening but also expanding despite repression, criminal prosecutions, and illegal punishments. As a result of these actions and attacks, the Russians leave the peninsula at every opportunity and flee. The KWEs, located in the northeast of the Crimean Peninsula, have become a frequent destination for those who want to escape to Russia from the peninsula. These days, Kerch Bridge is another escape route, especially when the train services on the Kerch Bridge started working again last month. The Moscow administration is constantly trying to put these escape plans and the activity in the peninsula into the background. In the Russian press, especially Russian President Vladimir Putin, has been acting as if everything is quite standard in Crimea for a long time. However, the situation is gradually changing. Last week, the Ukrainian General Staff reported that the pro-Russian administration has created evacuation plans in at least 3 regions in Crimea and has even begun to evacuate residents and especially families of officers in some regions. The most basic factor for the peak of the escapees from Crimea is the lack of life safety of the people living in the region. Attacks by Ukrainian forces are usually aimed at Russian military resources on the peninsula. However, the lives of civilians on the peninsula are also in danger as a result of the Russians' response to these attacks or attempts to shoot down Ukrainian WAVs. That's why nobody wants to stay in Crimea anymore. The possible attack of Ukraine on Crimea seems inevitable under the current conditions. And in this case, around 400,000 Russians are expected to leave the strategic peninsula in the first stage. It now looks like the first phase is almost complete. And even in the early stages of Phase 2, when Ukraine attacks, the Russian military presence in Crimea, both from the sea and air with its drone armies. This will cause a great panic for the Russians living on the peninsula, and the majority of the local Russian population will try to flee Crimea. Undoubtedly, this will be an expected result for the Russians to leave the peninsula twice as much as in the first stage. The rest of the Russians will likely be fully settled. Russians who are old and unable to leave. After all, the peninsula has always had a rich ethnic composition, and there has always been a certain percentage of Russian population. The current population of the peninsula has been determined as 2,400,000. Currently, the majority of the population is Russian, but there are a considerable number of Ukrainians and Crimean Tatars in Crimea. The demographic structure of Crimea has a very complex structure and history. The number of Russians in Crimea is around 1,500,000. In addition, there are 600,000 Ukrainian citizens, 300,000 Crimean Tatars, 40,000 Belarusians, 15,000 Armenians, and 5,500 Jews on the peninsula. The remainder are citizens of many different nationalities. Well, why is the issue of Crimea on the agenda again nowadays? The Ukrainian armed forces have shown that they can crush the Russian army, and that the Russian state is not great either politically, economically, or militarily. They showed that Russia is a pariah state. And if that is the case, then why should Russia be rewarded for its aggression? After all, if Crimea does not return to Ukraine, it will look like an award for Russia's aggression. How likely is it for a nuclear-powered state to provide security and territorial integrity guarantees to a non-nuclear state? Russia used Crimea to prepare an attack on Ukraine and may use Crimea to deploy nuclear weapons there. Also, Crimea is unique in that if it stays in Russia, it means that the trade in the Black Sea will be under constant threat. The resumption of peaceful navigation and peaceful maritime trade in the Black Sea is possible only if Crimea returns to Ukrainian control. From all military, economic, and strategic perspectives, Ukraine should take back Crimea, and Russia should be punished for its aggression, including Crimea. The head of Ukrainian intelligence recently spoke of the united return of Crimea, both by force and through diplomacy. Here we are talking explicitly about whether Russia has taken the first steps towards peace. It is clear that this will not happen, but when such options are mentioned, it is also wise to raise the issue of the fact that Russia will withdraw its troops and then begin serious peace negotiations. Then the question of the ownership of Crimea and the fact that Russian troops cannot stay on the territory of Crimea. In the past weeks, fantastic options have been discussed under the Turkish mediation, which will be a kind of transition period in which Crimea and Donbass issues will not be on the agenda. This is the maximum position that Russia is ready to take. It is hard to believe that any diplomatic means of returning Crimea are possible because Russia will not voluntarily make concessions and return Crimea to Ukraine. Therefore, it is necessary to get rid of any optimistic thoughts. Control over these regions is of strategic importance for both Ukraine and Russia. Such territories are not returned in negotiations. The only way for this option to materialize is for the regime change within Russia and the new democratic authorities to annul all the decisions of the Putin regime. But at the moment, there are no signs that Russia is approaching a revolutionary situation. Accordingly, there is no hope that the war can be ended by diplomatic means. So what you think about this subject? Please express your thoughts in the comments. Please do not forget to subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications in order to be informed about new videos. Thank you for watching us.